first encountered the idea of the macabre as a child through my father's vinyl records, and it was he who introduced me to that. They had a mix of rock and jazz and figures like Giuseppe Tartini and Niccolo Paganini, and it was music that gave me the lure of the unknown, so the dark symbolism, the demonic imagery, the whispered devil.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Resurrectionists podcast. This week, we are joined by Janica Buhagiar. She is a curator coordinator at Heritage Malta. She's studied the history of art and museum education at the University of Malta. She's also studied occult and Western exotericism at the University of Amsterdam and magic in the Middle Ages at Universitat de Barcelona. She's also published 2 books on dark tourism in Malta, which is the topic we are here to discuss today. Welcome to the show, Janica.
Thank you for inviting me and having me here.
It's if anyone's interested as well, I will link to your 2 books below because I feel like that would definitely be on topic and people's interest for what we're discussing today. Okay, so I think I first wanted to ask you, just looking through your background, obviously you studied history of art, you studied museum education, which plays into your current role, but you've also studied the occult and magic in the Middle Ages. You now do a lot of research and work in dark tourism. So what is it that sort of drew you to these areas? Like, what's your background and why is it that this is what you've kind of focused on in your education and your work?
Well, for one thing, I've always been drawn to these subjects, and I started in a non-academic environment, actually. I first encountered the idea of the macabre as a child through my father's vinyl records, and it was he who introduced me to that. They had a mix of rock and jazz and figures like Giuseppe Tartini and Niccolo Paganini, and it was music that gave me the lure of the unknown, so the dark symbolism, the demonic imagery, the whispered devil. And I heard the macabre before I ever truly saw it or studied it. And my mother, meanwhile, she led me to recreational visits to cemeteries. So even her literary place, they rarely strayed far from a witch or supernatural being. And another turning point was for me later on realizing that history is not compartmentalized as we tend to see it. It bleeds rather. It's not just mere chronology. It's the pulse of human experience, which can never be fully expressed through mere facts. So the idea of the unknown is essential to have a more holistic understanding of what it means to be human. So that is where it all started for me.
So I was hoping you could sort of give us an introduction into today's topic. So what is dark tourism for anyone who maybe isn't familiar with that phrasing?
Right. So dark tourism, it refers to the travel or visiting places that are associated with death, tragedy, or the seemingly macabre. And we say the seemingly macabre because it is quite subjective. What is macabre to me may not be macabre to another culture, another person. And there's a wide range of these sites, such as historic battlefields. There could be forts, memorials, shrines, cemeteries as well. And then there are also sites such as prisons and death camps. So there's a wide variety of those. But the important aspect that dark tourism wants to highlight is that despite that these sites have been traveled to and consumed for a very long time, for centuries, a good example of this is that Romans and Roman citizens would have traveled for days to, say, see a gladiatorial fight that is considered to be dark tourism as well. It is not just the statistic of it, but dark tourism also wants to go beyond that sensationalist label. It is about analyzing how societies confront mortality, trauma, and memory through a particular place and its artifact, if there are artifacts, right? And one of the fundamental questions that we ask is, how do we remember suffering? How do we aesthetize loss in this sense? It is much about empathy and education as is it about curiosity. So we have to find this fine balance.
It's interesting to think. I always think of dark tourism as a modern phenomenon. But then you talk about gladiators, I'm like, yes, that would definitely count as dark tourism.
Yes, it's the thing, isn't it? We have to be made aware of certain behaviors that we take for granted. And that is an important part in museology and pedagogy, is that usually people are so familiar with a particular context. But educators have this duty to abstract you from what is familiar to you or as a group or as a culture and show you the other perspective. Nowadays, in museums or even dark sites, we believe in multi-perspectivity. It's no longer just having a particular perspective, say the academic's perspective or the male perspective. And in that way, you're severely limiting the interpretation of a site or an artifact or a culture. You need a much deeper dimension than that. And dark tourism is a wonderful subject. You have wonderful sites where you have such opportunity to explore that about yourself and about the community and the culture you are part of, and against yourself and then the rest of the world as a member of the human race.
And do you think it's this connection that sort of attracts people to dark sites or macabre sites?
One of the main reasons when they conduct research is curiosity, right? But you have to go a bit beyond that. Once you have encouraged somebody to visit a site, then we have to, as educators or curators or whatever, to connect suffering and death to the public in a particular way. And there are ethical concerns regarding that, right? And ethical interpretation in this case is at the core of this work. These are not merely attraction, okay? They are spaces of memory and often trauma. And the key in this case is shown, I think. We have to foster understanding, reflection rather than spectacle. It is very easy when you look back at history and have this us versus them mentality, right? As historians, we are not there to judge or excuse the actions of a particular a person or a culture. None of us are perfect. We are there to learn, to understand their motivations, and understand that history is not black and white. And besides, with the idea of having things compartmentalized, it's not. It's an oversimplistic way of looking at history. History is a scale. It can be convoluted and difficult. It's rarely straightforward because human beings are complicated. That's really as simple as that. It's complicated. At the same time, we understand that the trauma that a culture might feel would make it easier for them to say us versus them. The rival quality that there might be, right? So we have to respect that as well. And it is how we engage with the community and the culture that we represent both sides, right? Whether it's a living community that is somehow easier because we can engage with them directly. But if that culture or that community is no longer there, say the Romans, you have a duty to represent them in a way that they are seen as best, in the best way that they interpret themselves through their own writings and their own artifacts, their own ideology. Because we have to keep in mind that the Romans, in this case, they no longer have a voice. So if you create some sort of a stigma towards people who are voiceless, then that does carry from one generation to another and from across time and space. And we have seen this many, many times. So historians have a duty to um, prepare and present these interpretations, whether they might be difficult for us as in the contemporary society to face, to digest. But that is, I think, that's one of the wonderful things about history, because when something provokes you in that way, it matters. And then we can really look at ourselves and say, why does it provoke me? Why is it troubling me? Why does it matter so much? This is the past. It's not supposed to matter in my present or my future. And that is where the magic happens. That is where the spark happens. And that is the beauty of history. Not just a list of facts and figures. That's all fine and very important and just as valid. But you need to make history live again, for lack of a better word.
Mm. Yeah, I always feel like dark tourism sites or macabre sites kind of put a human face back on the past. Like you say, it's not just numbers and figures. It's like these were people, these were the injustices they suffered, or the deaths that they had, or these were the camps that they were imprisoned in, or it just is a more human way of looking at it.
Most definitely. The problem with statistics is they are innately inhuman. That's the problem with them. They're important, but again, you give me percentages and numbers, and I can't connect with these people. It's even more difficult when you are not talking recent history, but the further you go in the past, like say Punic and Roman and so on, especially when you don't have it, when it's prehistory, especially. But that is where the theme of mortality and death is very strong in a pedagogical sense, because we all have to die. We all have to go through the experience, not just as an individual, but experience that as a culture, right? And that is part of the curiosity that I had mentioned before. Uh, there, there lies the human impulse to understand mortality, because even with today's technology and science, we are still asking the same questions that our ancestors had one. We have the same preoccupations, the same concerns, sometimes the same fears. And dark sides allow us to explore collective fears, human fears, and even fascinations in a safe, structured environment. And again, the moment of confrontation that is so important. It is not really about shock and horror. It's more about our shared humanity and fragility more than anything else.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful way of putting it. So, can you give me sort of an introduction maybe to some of the more popular or well-known dark sites in Malta, since that's where you're working?
Okay, so I'm hard pressed just to pick, but we have a large variety of them, and our most common dark sites, because they are grouped according to their particular function, are in fact burial sites, right? And from prehistory all the way to the modern period. And you have mentioned that one of my research was based on Victoria Cemetery, Cabra Cemetery, and it is um, not a very popular site in the sense that is not a typical tourist attraction, but it is gaining traction now because dark tourism is gaining in its popularity even with tourist guides, right? And the cemetery is a garden more than anything else of memory where you've got beautiful Victorian funerary arts and they rise with quite grandeur there. And its crowning jewel, it is the Hamilton Gordon Memorial Chapel. It was designed by a Victorian architect, quite a celebrated one, John Lovelock Pearson. And it is a supreme example of the high Victorian Gothic, and it has also Byzantine echoes. And you've got this singular work of funerary architecture standing as a unique 19th century monument to memory and empire. It's not far away from the capital city of Valletta. And then at the center of it, we've got St. John's Court Cathedral. It is one of Malta's most desolate sacred spaces and also one of Malta's grandest cemetery. So beyond the gilded splendor, the Baroque beauty that the Knights of St. John had created, you've got this marble floor, and it is a mosaic of that, right? And it's a spectacle of power, immortality, and wonder. And this is where different perspectives and narrative comes in. Usually, when visitors go to this wonderful cathedral, they don't realize that they are consuming dark tourism. This is a dark tourist site. They focus on other elements. Remember, this is where we have Caravaggio's masterpiece, The Beheading of St. John, his largest painting, and it's also his only signed painting. And even that painting is macabre because it shows the beheading of a person, right? In its gruesome, grisly detail. Yeah, Caravaggio was the virtuoso for that. But because people focus on other narratives, the holiness of it, Catholic duty, the splendor, salvation, you would forget the darker aspects of it, which are so essential in order to have the holistic experience that particular site is there to walk on, right? So even though both interpretations are equally valid, an educator, a tour guide, a curator have the obligation to pinpoint these contrasts and show you the bigger picture, right? It depends. I don't want really to see a dominant interpretation as such, because you can approach an object aside, an artifact in so many different ways. And that's really, about the different perspectives that makes human life so interesting. Another site, I think, obviously, I have to say that we've got St. Paul's catacombs. They are they're hewn into rock. This is a subterranean city of the departed. It starts off from Punic times to Roman and Byzantine times. And what I love about this is that, as per Roman law, the catacombs and hypogea, they had to be um, carved out beyond the city limits for sanitation reason. And it is away from the frantic bustle of now. We are so ingrained in. But once you go underground into these catacombs, you realize something so profound that in that quiet space, it's not about now. It is about forever. And that is one of the most profound realizations that such very good sites offer. We tend to forget about it. We lead such busy lives nowadays. But then the realization comes here and sometimes a good spot as well.
Yeah, I do always find that interesting about like cemeteries or obviously catacombs in particular, but they tend to be like quite tranquil places. Like even if they're in the middle of the city, somehow the noise just doesn't seem to impact it as much. And it is like you're entering a completely different space as well. Like you've been transported out of a city somehow when you enter these kind of places.
Have you visited such catacombs yourselves, or
I was at the catacombs in Paris. That's it. I need to visit more.
it's not just with catacombs, but it's more apparent with catacombs. But even with cemeteries, the idea that they are deliberately a separate space, almost a sacred prison beyond the urbanity of life. And it is, we see this with Abraxas Cemetery and other Victorian cemeteries. It is a deliberate space when we're there to contemplate your life, just to calm down a bit and reflect, and to remember that uh, there is an afterlife. Or if, and from the 19th century, and this is what I love about it may not be an afterlife. It was the first time in human history where one had the luxury to think in a way that was completely different and completely not allowed before the 19th century to still deliberate about human therapy and life, have to question whether there is an afterlife or even abroad. And these were the ideal spaces for it. And that is what makes art and architecture so powerful. We don't study emotions and expressions, right? It's not about that. Art and architecture is the physical, tangible manifestation of a culture's philosophy, theology, their ideology, and they present it to the world. It's what they were thinking, essentially. And that is what historians, for the most part, study, and other aspects as well, such as anthropology and psychology and so on. It's again, not simply a compartmentalized subject where it's just about chronology, as I said before. It's much, much deeper than that. And no wonder in America, especially, these are deemed as the liberal arts. These are the humanities because they, they, it's a reckoning with your own community. And that is what I like about them.
Yeah. So I one of the questions I had for you was, what do you think these sites offer that textbooks or museums can't? But obviously, like, as you've discussed, it's about being in the space. Like, you need to be there to understand and comprehend sort of the emotional attachment to it, to even just see the art and the architecture as well in person is different than, reading it in a book or seeing photographs in a museum out of context.
Exactly. And you touch upon a very important point here, the out of context. Absolutely nothing against books and videos and photographs because they're wonderful didactic materials, but they have their limitations. With what works of art and architecture, they're meant to be experienced on a physical level. So these sites, they offer presence. The fact that you say you enter into a cemetery or into a chapel, whatever, architecture has a psychological imprint on us. You may feel dwarfed by an architecture, or you feel liberated, but you feel that I think the catacombs, some people tend to feel a bit claustrophobic. That's intentional. That's part of the experience. And if you're standing within the physical space of death or another architecture that experienced dark history, there's the architecture, there's the temperature, there's the silence as well, just very profound. And then it's when you have created an embodied understanding that text cannot always convey. So it is about experience. As I said, one feels the weight of history when you are at the site, and it is in the atmosphere itself. And then you say, all right, this is what we were talking about. As museum educators, we have a main challenge of bringing context and being as authentic as we can, and that has its limitations. But when you've gone to the actual site, that helps a lot. The first thing I like to ask people, visitors, is what is the site telling you? What is the story behind you? It's not about being right or wrong, but let's take a moment and feel the space around you before we start with the facts and so on, right? I don't want you to desensitize the experience for you, right? Or make it overly sensational either. So it's always a fine balance.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like context is so important, especially in these cases as well. So you were talking about visitors there as well, and I suppose I was wondering, like I know we've talked about like how important it is, and they help people, these sites, you know, help people connect to the past, and it's not all about a curiosity, especially for us. But do you find when visitors first come to a site, is it about a morbid sort of curiosity for them that then maybe develops into a desire to understand more? Or do you think that they come wanting understanding and not just a sort of curiosity thing?
It really depends on the sort of visitors that you have. If, say, you have the typical traditional tour group, they have a limited amount of time. So it's basically just a check-in and a check, right? If you've got a school group students, they are more focused on their curriculum, right? So they have different needs. It depends on the individual. Most people who visit dark sites, according to studies, are motivated by curiosity. But if, say, you have a family and you've got children and they get bored at the catacombs because you've seen one catacomb and you've seen them all, I'm quoting here from what we sometimes hear our visitors say, and it is understandable. Um, you have to see who your target audience is. As I mentioned before, dark tourism now is there is a bigger awareness of it, and a lot of people are actively engaging in it. And we have particular events and groups that actively seek out these experiences. So it is about really finding or redefining what they already know about the sites. Because that's the thing, we are usually familiar with these sites, but we haven't really looked at them from a particular interpretation that is that tourism, right? Some sorts of identities about being provoked in a gentle manner, so you are more reflective, right? So when we have such visitors, we want them, we hope that they have a deeper awareness of how humanity has grappled with mortality or trauma, and whether it is done artistically or spiritually, ritually, and then decide, and the educators have fulfilled this purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So, as a sort of museum, like someone who's worked in Heritage Malta and with visitors, and sort of, how do you kind of try and engage them more in the site beyond just these are the facts of the site, but try and maybe help them to appreciate it as a whole?
We try to be as engaging as possible. It's a bit easier, so to speak, when it comes to burial sites because every culture, everybody has to experience that directly, of course. But because we're dealing with cultures that are no longer with us or who are different from us, and then we break it down to a more humane level that every culture grieves in its own way, and they have respect for their dead in their own way. And in some cases where there are certain rituals which may seem to contemporary society as being strange or unethical or even downright immoral, we are there to explain, listen, context is very important. You cannot apply contemporary, present ideas or context to the past. It's very easy to do, it's very easy to judge. right? It's a slippery slope. But this phenomenon of presentism is dangerous. Context is important. The idea that the past is just so atrocious and we are better than them now. The idea that men are just so awful, all of that because they have done all these great atrocities. We understand that, but we have to progress from that. By targeting a particular group, culture, or gender, it's not going to help. What have we learned from that? How can we apply today to be better? In the sense that we appreciate that there were some um, dark moments in history, atrocious moments. But keep in mind that 100 years down the line, people are going to judge us as well. So this is why we've been context. And as I said before, not to excuse what was wrong, but to explain. So the idea that as a very common aspect that comes across is the fact that women across time and space were more or less treated as a non-person, as a non-human. And how do we explain this? It's difficult, but it has to be explained and broken down. And then we also bring out this awareness. Listen, we've progressed from that. Okay. But on the other hand, I cannot be so judgmental on the past. A good way of doing that as well is to say, if you were in that situation, would you have done better or worse? It's easy to say that you have done better, but when you bring out all the details, it's not as straightforward because, as I said before, history is not black and white because humanity is not black and white. Then you start to realize that there are difficult choices that ordinary people have to do. Or in some cases that we sometimes do things, rituals, or we follow rules or regulations that we sometimes don't realize how wrong they are. But because we're in a context of a culture and nobody tells you otherwise, you keep on repeating it. But once somebody speaks up and breaks that cycle, then you start to realize. But again, the most important aspect in dark tourism side is that, listen, it could have been anybody else, right? And we have to be vigilant of ourselves. In fact, we have so many social mechanisms nowadays that keeps us in check and authorities in check because we can slip like that. And that's human nature. And that's fine because we accept it, we acknowledge it, and we keep in mind that this is something that we have to watch out for. And that is how humanity improves. Again, blaming them. But we understand that that trauma, especially if it's in the recent past. With catacombs, for example, that doesn't show up as much. But if you look at that camp, as you have mentioned, then it's difficult. A bit more difficult. That is why we have more people to help and treat it in a more sensitive manner. But sensitivity is key. But just because we confront ourselves in the past does not make it any less sensitive. It can be difficult, but it's through the difficulty that we become more enlightened.
And you've mentioned a bit about sort of the ethics around dark tourism sites as well. So, kind of, can you talk maybe a bit about what it is that you feel should be put in place or is put in place to ensure that we are being as ethical as we can be about making these sites into tourist attractions, especially the ones that are in more recent history?
Absolutely. Like the ethical interpretation. So we start off from there. So when we, as curators and museum educators, are interpreting, we bring multi-perspectivity, as I've said. And again, it's not about judgment. I know I'm repeating. These are sites that are not merely attractions. Okay, this is not about there. These are spaces of memory and often trauma. And we have they offer the space for reflection. So it is not just like presented you with fact, this transmission absorption thing. It can be a bit passive for visitors and they forget really what they read. So thought-provoking questions that I think it's very effective. Workshops, if it's recent history, you can have people with that particular community to express their concerns and their memories, their experiences, and this can be recorded, make it a bit more alive. Again, it depends on the site, right? And we have to respect the people who have passed, the dead, and the communities who once engaged with this space. And it's an interpretation between education, reverence, and engagement. And obviously, how visitors behave on these sites. These are sites where people have suffered, where they have been buried. We still unfortunately find examples of vandalism, disrespect, people who rifle tombs, or if you even look throughout the internet, there are inappropriate selfies in, say, death camps and so on. We have to just remember these are sites that need to be respected because it will help any of us. And how we act is really not just a reflection on the past, but also on ourselves as well. So, yes, these are the main ethical constraints, how we interpret them as curators or educators, but also um, we expect visitors as well to show an amount of respect. And I believe we are making progress on that front as well.
So, with regard to people visiting these sites as well, and maybe not with the best of intentions or with the most educated and empathetical mindset, do you generally think it is a good idea that these sites are open to the public? Or maybe are there certain sites that we shouldn't be encouraging people to visit? Or do you think that educating people and showing them these sites generally helps people to understand, and therefore you're less likely to get this behavior from it?
There are two sides, there are two camps regarding that issue. Some people believe that uh, because of the dark history associated with these sites and the trauma that some people or culture or community has experienced, it should not be a tourist attraction. These sites should not be exported for money. On the other hand, you've got people like me. I believe that these sites should be open to the public because we need to be made aware. If this happens in the past, this is valid factual history, then yes, we should confront it. That being said, we have to safeguard the space, the site, so be tangible, as well as the intangible to people who have suffered there as well. And we cannot always do that. As I said, every site, sometimes we experience vandalism, disrespect, and even sometimes a lack of understanding. It could be as simple as a review or a comment, right? I believe in that sense, it's more about a matter of increasing awareness and education. If you close that site off, I believe it could be even more damaging because you risk that site, that pain, the trauma being forgotten, or even worse, being repeated. Because I don't think we sometimes realize how easy it is for us as a species to slip into that darkness within us. And sometimes we don't even realize. A while back, and this has nothing to do with history per se, but I was watching an interview. It's it was about the cast of a particular film, and this actor who was representing. Nazi official who was sampling down Jews. And the journalist asked him, wasn't it difficult for you to interpret such a monster on screen, such an evil person? And the actor replied, he, the character, he didn't think it was evil. And it was a very thought-provoking comment because most, cultures, communities, and individuals who have committed heinous crimes never thought of themselves as evil. They thought they were doing things for the greater good. This is the best way forward. And again, this is how we have to keep ourselves in check. And that is why, personally, I believe that these sites should be open to the public, not in an exploit yourself, in an exploited way, whether it is through interpretation or through other means. But I fully believe that, yes, they should be open for that reason alone.
Yeah, no, I feel like I agree with you. I think that they do have their purpose in being open, that we learn from them, we learn about the past, we learn about potentially downfalls of the future if we, follow previous ways of being. Also, I just think if they're open, they're more likely to be protected as well because they're bringing money in too, which is always helpful in protecting the heritage and history of things too.
On the other hand, that can be problematic because some people would argue, why are you generating profits from somebody else's trauma? Okay.
Mm.
Again, as a curator, museum educators, and so on, this is our juggling act. You want to preserve the site, you want to make it accessible for the public, but you do need money to do that. And it's not that there is where the challenge comes in. We're not here to exploit, we're here to safeguard. But since the real world religion, we do need money at the end of the day. But it's how we handle it then, how we invest this money and make it as impactful in a non-sensationalist way, but in a gentle, provoking manner that people remember what this site is about. You don't want people leaving your site, or whatever it is, whether it's a burial site or, say, a battlefield, and they forget what it's about. They don't connect with it. That's the worst thing I think you can do. It's just as disrespectful for the people who have suffered there.
So is that kind of the main thing you want people to take away from these sites is that sort of sense of connection with the past as well, and with these people if it's a burial site, or with the history if it's a structure or something like that?
Definitely, that's one of the things I want our visitors to take away. A sense of humility as well, a sense of awareness. Again, it depends on the site, but since I deal with burial sites, the idea, really the fact that is universal, but remembrance is cultural, and there is no better remembrance than the other, right? This is why we explain the different contexts and how people are remembered, and if they are so different and strange from your current type of remembrance, that doesn't mean that yours is worse or better. And I think I would like users to leave with a deeper sense of how humanity has grappled with mortality in a different manner, artistically, spiritually, and ritually. And if my sites have managed to do this, then they have fulfilled their purpose.
And do you feel like there are any major misconceptions that people have about dark tourism in general that maybe isn't true, or is only in small cases and isn't generally the truth of dark tourism?
Yes, that dark tourism is inherently voyeuristic or morbid. In reality, it can be deeply ethical, even healing or closure when it is framed correctly. It teaches us empathy, it teaches us resilience. That despite these dark chapters in human history, humanity has still continued. Others wouldn't be here. We have learned from the past. We have remained here. We have still helped each other. We've been kind to one another. And it's not just the historical awareness of it, but the idea that, listen, we're always going to face challenges, that we will carry on. The resilience of it. I think that's very important. It's certainly not about glorifying deaths or killing. It's about understanding life through these inevitable counterparts. It's so necessary. The darkness, it is that helps you to, as we have probably heard the saying, that you have to see the light through the darkness. And both counterparts are important.
Yeah, I always sort of the one of the big dark tourism sites I went to when I was in college was Auschwitz. And I feel like what made me sort of realize that it wasn't just an educational thing, that this was impactful for people now and people then, was they were talking about how when they opened it as a tourist attraction, it was some of the people who'd been interred there or their family members who were a part of opening it back up to the public. And so I always sort of thought of that as like, okay, these aren't just like morbidly fascinating sites. Like these are healing for maybe the people who were there, for their families, for future people. Like they want these things to be remembered. It's not, because I was always a bit like, oh, I don't know if it's ethical to be visiting Auschwitz. Like there were terrible things happen there. But then to know that like those people were involved in the process kind of gave it a new light to me as well.
Uh, Definitely. And this is a particular um, there's a particular side of this work that can, because it is in recent history. So when we categorize dark sides, and here I'm going to quote Dr. Philip Stone's Dark Tourism Spectrum, who he wrote about in 2006. And not only did she categorize the different types of dark sides that we have, whether they are cemetery or a dungeon or an exhibition, but he also made a very important point. A site is considered to be darker if it has more educational impact, more gravitas, more political and media involvement, and more immorality. So the darkest along the spectrum, according to Dr. Philip Stone, are the dark camps of genocide. They're in recent history. They're at such an impact in politics and education. A stark contrast to this is these dark fun factories, as he called them, such as the London dungeons. The darkest on the spectrum are the dark camps of genocide, such as Auschwitz. The other side of the spectrum, the lighter side of the spectrum, is what Dr. Philip Stone described as dark fun factories, such as the London dungeons. So this is our recreation. There's nothing authentic about it. It can be quite droll as well. So that is the stark contrast. So when you engaged with that dark side, that genocide camp, you were meant to feel that weight. And he helps us, Dr. Philip Stone, to understand why you and most visitors would feel that it's a recent memory. And the fact that it has more gravitas, for example. And that directly influences the type of interpretation that you that you do, or you believe in, that you have a responsibility to do. With dark resting places or dark burials, they are more or less on the middle of the spectrum. Um, it's difficult. It's a place where people are put to rest. There is a great sense of respect and love. it can still help us confront our immortality, but it's so different than the dark camps of Genesis that you have mentioned. You feel it, and that is all an essential part of the interpretation, that you feel this, not just read about it.
Mm-hmm. So I know you've mentioned a few sites in Malta before, and you've written books about sites in Malta. Is there any that you would recommend, if you could only pick one or two to recommend to people who are visiting Malta? Which ones would you say maybe encompass history better, or a specific event to kind of give people a good introduction, maybe?
I couldn't. Well, I believe in this variety, because aesthetic guitar tourism, you got this variety, which makes it ideal to be attractive to people and a good vehicle for them to learn. So I would suggest various sites, whether it's the Bruxa Cemetery. We have another wonderful cemetery, the Addolorata Cemetery at Pietà, St. John's School Cathedral as well. That is another a wonderful burial site. But also, it is also a site about salvation and the Baroque splendor that only the lights could orchestrate. Regarding another dark side, I would also mention the. So I would also suggest the Inquisitor's Palace in Burgos, and this is especially reflective of the 17th century in Malta, and it is a period that is quite turbulent. There, and it was a time of recurrent outbreaks of plague, and most devastatingly in the late 17th century, where a third of Malta's population was perished. It haunted towns and villages. Medicine could offer little relief. Famine and scarcity loomed, and there was a constant threat of courtier raids, even though Malta itself participated in the same trade, and that's also part of dark tourism, courtier raids, slavery, so on. And there at the Inquisitor's Palace, and we see how it reinforced its rigid orthodoxy, and it was persecuting blasphemy, heresy, and witchcraft, even moral deviance, so that they considered to be moral deviance, right? And it is really a place where justice at that time for its own cruelty, it had executions and punishments that were staged as public theater, right? It was an age in which women, especially, and non-Christians were systematically oppressed, and an era where faith and fear were entwined with power, and where survival itself, it was often felt precarious, right? Hence, I would suggest in Crusade Palace to see that part of its many interpretations. But again, yet the very aim of history is to show that we have learned, we have evolved, and we must resist repeating such mistakes. And you can always stop repeating kind of mistake if you're aware of it. That's why I believe that the bound, this particular moment should be open to the public and be made aware of it.
Is there anything else maybe that we haven't touched on yet that you feel is important for people to know about dark tourism, or specifically dark tourism in Malta?
Not particularly. I believe we have touched on most of it. I would like to like people to know that dark tourism is very diverse, and we are raising the awareness of what dark tourism is, because sometimes we don't even realize we're consuming dark tourism. And dark tourism is not just simply the sites; it's also the artifacts. It could be now certain foods, for example, like I don't know, certain food like coffee. It came in with the slave trade, for example. Even if you look at a harbor, even along Grand Harbor, It was not simply a place for trade, but there were prostitutes there who were trying to make a living. So it's not just looking at a particular site and see its beauty, but it also has these dark moments. Again, just don't look at the dominant narrative, look beyond that. The dominant narrative is just invalid, and if you just fear to experience that itself, finding the value with us, it's not an issue. But there is there are shadows lurking all around us, and I think it's an ideal time now. Halloween is just it's a week's time to realize this that we are living in a liminal space between darkness and light.
Mhm. And if anyone is interested in learning more about dark tourism, would you have any recommendations where they might be able to, besides your books, obviously, but any other recommendations for where they might be able to learn a little bit more?
If you want a more academic take on it, I would suggest Dr. Philip Stone and his book. He's got entire textbooks written on the subject and book, apart from your tourism. But really, it's about experiencing these sites and looking at the sites in a different perspective. And on it, that's really what these sites really need rather than just the academic analysis, which is just as important. But you have to experience darkness to know what it's really about.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much, Janica, for coming onto the show and for discussing dark tourism with us. It's really been very fascinating. And I hope that everyone out there now goes and visits their local dark tourism site. Go do it. I don't know if there's any around me. I'm going to have to try and find one now, but go visit your sites. Support your local dark tourism site.
Yes, and just to conclude, I'm going to quote the poet Rumi here: "Let darkness be your candle."
Ooh, I love that. I was like, oh, on that beautiful note, thank you everybody for listening, and we will see you all in next week's episode. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.